The plane carrying the coffin of former U.S. President Ronald Reagan has arrived at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, outside the U.S. Capitol. The plane will be welcomed by an honor cordon and the Army band. Once the casket has been removed from the plane, Reagan's family will travel with it into Washington for the formal funeral procession. Reagan's family watched as the coffin was taken from his Simi Valley Library by a full military honor guard earlier this Wednesday. At least 100,000 mourners have passed by the coffin at the Presidential Library in California since Monday. Of course, Ronald Reagan died in Los Angeles on Saturday, aged 93, after a 10-year battle with Alzheimer's disease. This, the presidential plane, which has arrived at the Andrews Air Force Base and pulled into position with the hearse awaiting the coffin of the former President Ronald Reagan. This plane, normally used as an alternate to Air Force One, has been given a flight destination of Special Air Mission 28,000, or SAM 28,000, as it's known in the military. That's the number on its tail fin. And arrived in Washington just a couple of minutes ago, where it's taxied to a halt and where the coffin will be put into a hearse to be driven into Washington. Reagan's family watched as the coffin was taken from his Simi Valley Library by a full military honor guard, and his wife, Nancy Reagan, will be staying at Blair House, the official guest residence across the street from the White House, during the period in Washington. Of course, the state funeral today, Wednesday, the national funeral on Friday. Ronald Reagan's body will be transferred by motorcade from the Andrews Air Force Base into the center of the city, according to the White House, and there the coffin will be carried to a horse-drawn gun carriage for the journey to Capitol Hill. Military band played Hail to the Chief as the flag-draped coffin was carried from the Presidential Library in California, and the gathered representatives from the armed forces all saluted their former commander-in-chief. The plane that brought the coffin of the former President Ronald Reagan has arrived at the Andrews Air Force Base in Washington. Leaders from around the world will attend the national funeral service at Washington's National Cathedral on Friday. And the head of the city's police estimates that more than 100,000 people will pay their respects ahead of the funeral. Washington hasn't staged an event on this scale since the funeral of President Lyndon Johnson in 1973. And the US government's declared the mourning of Ronald Reagan a special national special security event. And after the funeral service on Friday, Reagan's body will be taken back for the private burial in California at sunset on Friday. And while we await the coffin from the plane, the special presidential plane that has brought Ronald Reagan's coffin from California to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, let me just bring in my colleague Jonathan Aiken, who joins us from the CNN bureau in Washington. Jonathan.
It's returning to Washington on this plane, the military version of a Boeing 747. Here you see Mrs. Reagan coming out the front door of the plane known as Air Force One when the president is on board. She's accompanied by an Army general who is head of the military district of Washington. This is the Army command that is in charge, especially of ceremonial events within the nation's capital, and the group within the military that is in full charge of the state funeral and all the honors being accorded to Mr. Reagan today. Mrs. Reagan, who looks so much alive when in the company of her husband, looked in the words of one commentator here over the past 24 hours, always within the arm of this Army general, but still looking very much alone as she descends the steps at Andrews Air Force Base. As I mentioned, this plane was one of two 747s that Mr. Reagan actually had commissioned to be built while he was still president to replace the 707s, including the one that bore John Kennedy's body back from Dallas, Texas in 1963. It was hoped by Boeing, the manufacturer of the aircraft, that Mr. Reagan would be able to fly home on his final flight from Washington to California on board this plane. They couldn't finish it in time. So somewhat appropriate that his final journey to Washington will be on board this aircraft he commissioned, and the interior of which Mrs. Reagan helped to design. We're told that this particular aircraft is designed in muted colors, representing the muted colors of the West, especially at sunset. Family members joining Mrs. Reagan as they head down the stairs. She is going to be brought over close to where the hearse containing her husband's body is located within the procession, and that procession will begin to snake its way from the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Into the center of town. The plan, Becky, is for the body to be brought by hearse from Andrews Air Force Base on a rather circuitous route. It will cross the Potomac River into Virginia, head up a scenic parkway that offers a splendid view of monumental Washington. They will cross the Potomac again at the Memorial Bridge, which is the link between the Lincoln Memorial, which looks like the Parthenon, and Arlington National Cemetery. It is scheduled to arrive at the White House just about 6 o'clock Eastern Time. And that's just not quite an hour from now. At about 6:05, this casket, which is about to be put in a hearse at Andrews, will be taken from a hearse at 16th and Constitution, about 2 blocks from the White House, and then put on board an Army caisson that was built in 1918, originally to carry a 75mm cannon in battle. And it will be used to carry the president's body down Constitution Avenue, accompanied by a flyover of F-15 jets. It will arrive at the west steps of the White House, looking west out to the Potomac and west toward Mr. Reagan's beloved California. 99 steps this casket crew will have to climb in order to reach the Capitol Rotunda, where Mr. Reagan's body will lie in state for 34 hours. And they're expecting now, based on the larger than expected crowds in California who viewed Mr. Reagan and paid their respects, they're anticipating at least 200, maybe even 225,000 people to pass through the Capitol between this evening when the doors open to the public and early Friday morning when they will close.
There's halt. Ready. Face.
This coffin, by the way, is made out of mahogany. It weighs between 425 and 450 pounds. And as you look at the flag draping the casket, the field of stars representing the 50 states, each star representing a state, is placed so that the stars are located over Mr. Reagan's heart. And that is a tradition in state funerals in the United States.
Ready, step, foot,
go in on the balcony.
Halt. 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 Halt.
And as the door of the hearse is closed, the former President Ronald Reagan's body will be transferred by motorcade into the center of Washington. There, the coffin will be carried to a horse-drawn gun carriage for the journey to Capitol Hill. Then, like Presidents Lincoln, Kennedy and Eisenhower before him, Reagan's body will then lie in state. You were listening to My Country, 'Tis of Thee, a favorite patriotic hymn for Americans, often known as the unofficial national anthem. Now, the easily singable words of the song are matched with a popular international melody used by many nations, including England, where it accompanies God Save the King or Queen. Written in 1832, a 24-year-old theological student, Samuel Francis Smith, penned these lines for the Americans on a scrap of paper. And from then on, that became the unofficial national anthem. And as we watch these pictures of the hearse to join a motorcade which will transfer the coffin of Ronald Reagan to the center of Washington, where people have already started queuing for the Capitol many hours before they'll have the chance to pay their respects. Some 200,000 to 250,000 people expected to pay their respects to the former president as his coffin lies in state at the Capitol. The National Memorial on service on Friday, and then his body to be returned to his state of California, where there will be a private funeral. You're watching CNN live pictures from the Andrews Air Force Base in Washington as we watch the hearse carrying the coffin of the former President Ronald Reagan leaving the Air Force Base on its journey into the center of the city, where the coffin will be carried to a horse-drawn gun carriage for the journey to Capitol Hill. And here's a look at the schedule for Reagan's funeral cortege, which will follow in the coming hours. At 2200 GMT, the procession to the US Capitol begins. Reagan's casket will be transferred there, as I say, onto a horse-drawn caisson, and we will bring you that live. That will be followed by a state funeral ceremony in the US Capitol Rotunda. Public viewing begins at 0:30 GMT on Thursday and continues through the night. Let's take a short break. The news headlines after this. The center of Washington, past which the motorcade carrying the hearse with the coffin of the former President Ronald Reagan will pass. The body of the former US president has arrived in Washington, of course, at Andrews Air Force Base, just about 30 minutes ago in Maryland, now on its way in a motorcade into the center of Washington for national memorial services. His body will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol until Friday. And these pictures of the scenes in Washington as tens of thousands of people line the route, awaiting the motorcade with the hearse carrying the coffin of the former president, Ronald Reagan, into Washington, where his body will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol until Friday. Let's bring you the other headlines now this hour. And leaders from the Middle East have joined G8 leaders in the U.S. state of Georgia. They're discussing a U.S. initiative to promote democratic reform and human rights throughout the Arab world. And a suspected bomb blast has rocked a busy shopping district in Cologne, injuring 17 people, 4 of them seriously. The explosion occurred in a predominantly Turkish area of the German city. Authorities have not ruled out terrorism as the cause. Well, Iraq's interim prime minister is hailing the new UN resolution mapping out the country. You're with CNN, and the body of former President Ronald Reagan is en route to Capitol Hill in Washington, where thousands of people are waiting to pay their final respects. The plane carrying the former president's casket arrived at Andrews Air Force Base less than an hour ago. Reagan's plane was greeted by a military cordon and the Army band, which played "Hail to the Chief" as the casket was removed from the plane. The coffin, Reagan's wife Nancy and his 2 sons and daughter are traveling into Washington with a military escort at present. Here's a look at the schedule. Reagan's funeral cortege will follow in the coming hours. In just a few minutes, the formal funeral procession to the U.S. Capitol begins. Reagan's casket will be transferred onto a horse-drawn caisson, and do stay with CNN for live coverage of that. Afterwards, a state funeral ceremony in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Public viewing begins at 0:30 GMT on Thursday and continues through the night. And there's a special second edition of our website dedicated to remembering Ronald Reagan's life and legacy. There's also a link that allows you to share your own thoughts on the impact that he had as a US president. Do find all of that at cnn.com/Reagan. Okay, let's recap the day's main news and business headlines at this point. I'm Becky Anderson. Good night from London.
It's been more than 30 years since there's been a state funeral in the United States, the last time for the late President Johnson, now for the late President Ronald Reagan. And to our viewers in the United States and around the world, you're looking at these live pictures of Constitution Avenue, where the motorcade carrying the casket is about to arrive, and it will stop on Constitution Avenue, Paula, and the casket will be removed and placed on a caisson for the final procession up to Capitol Hill.
This is a process that presidents are supposed to take a great deal of involvement in particular the last year of the office. There's this group called the Military District of Washington, which asks for very specific plans, and we know that Nancy Reagan has reviewed the plans on an annual basis since President Reagan signed off on them.
This is the motorcade that our viewers are seeing on Constitution Avenue. It has crossed the Memorial Bridge. It is now approaching 16th Street, the Ellipse, not far from the White House, where it will stop. The casket will be removed from the hearse and begin the next leg of this journey to Capitol Hill. It's going to be momentarily before this happens.
And when that happens, I know that for a generation or two of us, that will bring back memories of the Kennedy funeral, because one of the most iconic memories that we all have of that is the casket on the caisson being drawn by the horses. It was black and white because that's the kind of television we had, which fitted the mood. Those muffled drums and that whole feeling of grief. It's a completely different kind of day. It's a completely different ceremony. But some events that stick in your mind are just naturally going to come back when you see anything resembling that.
It's a caisson, for our viewers who are not necessarily familiar with the history, is French for a chest packed with explosives that was, in the olden days, laid in the way of an enemy and exploded, supposedly, upon the enemy's approach. Historically, it was used to carry a 75-millimeter cannon, but it's now being used, Professor Dallek, in a traditional way to carry the casket on the final journey to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, this is a strong tradition. It goes with the whole business of a state funeral, and Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson had this, and certainly John Kennedy. Your memories of this, Jeff, are, I think, right on the mark. And the horse that we will see, and
the riderless horse.
The riderless horse with the boots in the stirrups, facing backward as if the president is sitting in that saddle and looking back toward the troops he's leading. And so it's really a poignant image that we carry of all these funerals.
And there it is. There's the caisson. There are the horses, the moving, bringing this caisson up on Constitution Avenue. Jean Meserve is right there. Jean, share with us what you're seeing.
Well, I'm seeing what you're seeing, largely that caisson, a 1918 construction originally built to haul howitzers around, has been re-outfitted in order to carry the very heavy coffins and caskets that it carries at Arlington National Cemetery. Now we're seeing the honor guard, the color guard move into place. Also, they've moved up the horse, the riderless horse. Sergeant York is his name. He's a standard-bred horse, once raced, but he was not very successful at that. He is all black, which is a rarity in these horses, so they moved him to this duty. We can see now the boots in his stirrups. These, we're told, are boots that Ronald Reagan used. He was a member of the U.S. Army Reserves, Horse Cavalry, and after he retired, he still favored wearing these military-style boots with nickel spurs. They were among his favorites to use at the ranch and also at Camp David. This is a pair that has been used at the Reagan Library.
That's a beautiful horse with the boots in reverse, I guess underscoring, Paula, that no longer will the commander-in-chief be a warrior, if you will. It's sort of symbolic that the boots have been put in reverse and no longer able to ride this horse. So we're going to watch all of this unfold, all this very, very dramatic history unfold. It's been very, very carefully planned out. One thing we should point out to our viewers, that once the casket is put upon that caisson, it will move methodically, slowly up in the procession to Capitol Hill, followed by the honor guard, the color guard, the marching bands, all of the procession very, very carefully designed to underscore the dignity of this very solemn event.
This also reminds us that the military traditions that underlie these kinds of events. It's not just the caisson, which was used to take artillery onto the field. Sergeant York, that was a great World War I American hero. We still, and there's Nancy Reagan right now.
Nancy Reagan, and she's with Major General Galen Jackman, who's the commander of the military unit in charge of this entire protocol. Let's listen in as she's applauded by the thousands who have gathered.
On occasion, you can hear out of the cacophony, "We love you, Mrs. Reagan." One of her assistants, Nancy Drake, has said what has been so comforting to the First Lady over the last several days has been the amount of support her family has gotten, the overt show of love for her husband.
Sir. That's it, right here.
God bless you, Nancy. Forward. Left wheel. Whoo! Forward. Whoo!
We told everyone they had to stay inside. This is good. This is important.
So on.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
And so there it is, the caisson carrying the casket of Ronald Reagan, literally in the shadow of the south lawn of the White House across from the Ellipse. The caisson now on Pennsylvania Avenue, surrounded by representatives of all branches of the United States military. There are 6 horses that are saddled, which will take this caisson, Paula, up Constitution Avenue, but only riders on 3 sides, on 3 of the horses on the left side of this procession. This is a tradition that began when the horse-drawn artillery days, in the olden days when riders would only mount one side along the lines of this kind of caisson, which under older days would carry a howitzer or artillery, but now carrying a casket.
These horses have come from various caisson units in Illinois, Virginia, Texas, and Maryland. Once the caisson starts moving towards the Capitol, it'll be about a 1.5 mile route. And already, as Anderson Cooper reported a little bit earlier this evening, there are thousands of people already waiting in line to view the president's casket once the public viewing starts around 9:30 this evening. The one shot that has struck me so far was the shot of the riderless horse, and Nancy Reagan asked that the president's boots be inserted into those stirrups. And it reminded me a story that I heard just 2 nights ago from one of President Reagan's Secret Service agents, a man who served him for 17 years, most of that time obviously after he was out of office. And he talked about how they spent a lot of time riding on the ranch together, and there was a day where he didn't think the president mounted the horse very well, and he was shaken by that. And he went back to Mrs. Reagan at the ranch and said, "Mrs. Reagan, I think that should be the president's last ride." And she said to him, "I can't tell him that. You have to tell them that." So he tried to figure out how to break the news to the president. At this time, the president was already suffering from Alzheimer's. He found a time when the president was relaxing and reading by a fire at the ranch. And he approached him and he said, "Mr. President, you're such a supreme equestrian and you had some problems out there today." And he said, "I think it would be a good idea if you stopped riding." And he said the president looked at him with this look of wisdom in his eyes and he said, "I know, you're right." And he said from that point on, they never had another discussion about riding.
This horse is saddled with the reverse boots, as we've been pointing out in the stirrups, to symbolize that the warrior will never ride again. And by the way, the boots are Ronald Reagan's own riding boots, and that was the request of Nancy. Here is the procession beginning actually on Pennsylvania Avenue, and this process will continue for some time until it reaches Capitol Hill.
Ronald Reagan loved horseback riding. It's one of the most frequently seen moments. He used to say the best thing for the inside of a man is the outside of a horse. And it was one of his favorite activities. So there is a particularly appropriate symbol of this horse carrying the president's boots as they go down Pennsylvania Avenue.
And there's Mrs. Reagan. She's in the limousine. She's not walking. She's following this procession. Clearly encouraged. She's waving, as we can all see, to the crowd out there. She must be so moved by the huge crowds that have gathered along this procession.
It's been interesting to me to see how the perceptions of Nancy Reagan have changed since she left the White House with her husband. And I think there's such a great deal of compassion in this country for the amount of devotion she has shown her husband during this very long journey of his.
She was, as First Lady, a controversial figure. There were stories about, she used to make fun of the notion that she spent money on China for the White House. Once Ronald Reagan became afflicted with Alzheimer's, and she struggled with that. She gave a very moving speech at, I think, the 96th Republican Convention, where she talked about Ronnie's very long goodbye. And I think no matter how you felt about the Reagans as political figures, no one can look at what she went through without seeing that devotion and that concern.
Let's listen in now to the sights and sounds of these dramatic moments as this procession moves down Constitution Avenue to Capitol Hill.
I'm about ending. I'm done. All right. Okay. That's it.
This procession moving down Constitution Avenue towards Capitol Hill, representatives of all branches of the United States military participating on this extremely hot and very humid day in the nation's capital. We've already been receiving some reports that some of those troops, some of those military personnel already overcome by the heat, having to drop out themselves, getting some minor medical attention, Paula. But it is a hot Washington summer day.
92 degrees late this afternoon. Although the temperatures dropped just a couple of degrees, it is still so humid that it's just stifling out there. Let's go back to Jean Meserve, who was at the transfer point when the casket was taken out of the hearse and then put on the caisson. You, Jean, have had the opportunity to talk with a lot of the folks gathered there. What was the reaction to seeing this piece of history made?
Well, what was amazing to me, Paula, was to be in the middle of this throng of people. There were thousands around this location, and they were so silent. There was those occasional shouts to Nancy Reagan of, "We love you, God bless you." But apart from that, the only thing you heard was the clicking of camera shutters. People were absolutely silent. You saw in the crowd a few American flags. You saw a few portraits of the president. There's one California flag that was suspended across the roadway. A few children being hoisted in the air to get a better view. But an incredible feeling of solemnity and respect. As you mentioned, as the procession drove off, Nancy Reagan waved at the crowd. I have to tell you that the members of the crowd were waving silently back at her. Paula?
And Jean, how are people bearing up in this heat? We've talked about some of the folks involved in the actual formal part of the procession have already been overcome by heat.
I have not seen any evidence of that here. It has been very hot, but there are a few shade trees. For a while, people were trying to cluster under them. I have not seen anybody overcome. They've tried to be very careful, I think, to provide water to many of the military and law enforcement personnel along the route here protectively. I will say that, you know, they just recently had the World War II memorial dedication. That was a very elderly population, and a lot of planning went in there to the medical side of the event. They tried to take that into account here. They tried to have some water prepositioned at medical teams on the prowl so they could give assistance to people who might be overcome. But I haven't seen it right where I am, right here.
All right, Jean, we'll come back to you a little bit later on. Well,
Judy Woodruff, Paula's up on Capitol Hill awaiting the arrival of this procession. Judy, as we all know, there will be a very dramatic moment as this procession winds up on Capitol Hill, when there will be a flyover to symbolize once again the support, the honor, the dignity that this president deserves. Give our viewers a little flavor of what we can expect as it makes its way up to the Rotunda where you are on Capitol Hill.
Wolf, you're absolutely right. There will be, in fact, there'll be a number of dramatic moments. One will be the flyover. This is a ceremony that has been worked literally minute by minute by minute, down to the seconds, no doubt. They are planning for the arrival of Mrs. Reagan in the limousine already. We have members of the Cabinet, Secretary of State Colin Powell and others arriving here at the Capitol. Former presidents are arriving here in the Rotunda. The Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist, other members of the Supreme Court. This will be a collection of the most powerful people in this country in the Rotunda there for this ceremony that will take place at 7 o'clock Eastern. It is, again, carefully orchestrated. There will only be remarks from 3 people, from the President Pro Tem of the Senate, Ted Stevens. You're looking now at an overhead picture of the Rotunda of the Capitol. This is where the President Ronald Reagan's casket will lie in state from this evening until Friday morning, when it will be taken to the National Cathedral here in Washington for the funeral services. But we will hear from Ted Stevens, the President Pro Tem of the Senate. We will hear from the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert, and we will hear from Vice President Dick Cheney. We will not hear from President Bush. As all of us know, he is in Sea Island, Georgia, for the meeting of the Group of 8, the summit that has been taking place the last few days on the Georgia coast. After we hear from each of those 3, they will place a wreath at the casket. There will be a musical selection and a benediction, and then the service will be over. This will be a very brief service. The funeral on Friday will be longer. It will run, I believe, about an hour and a half. This service, again, bringing together the diplomatic corps, members of the Bush cabinet, the cabinet of this president, again, governors of the United States, Supreme Court justices, Again, the most powerful people in the country coming together, Republicans and Democrats. Partisan politics is pushed aside for this week in order for everyone to pay respect and to honor the 40th president.
And as we look at this split picture, the picture of the procession bringing the casket of Ronald Reagan, Judy, up to Capitol Hill, where you are, I want to bring back Frank Sesno, who's watching all of this together with all of our viewers. Frank covered the Reagan administration. He's our former CNN Washington bureau chief. Frank, this is so vintage, not only the pomp and circumstance, the dignity of the U.S. government, the history of what's unfolding, but specifically what Nancy Reagan herself wanted.
Very much so. Both Mrs. Reagan and the former late president met with planners, and they signed off on all the details of this. And Mrs. Reagan has said that she and the president felt that this was fitting, that this was an important way to acknowledge the grandeur of the office and the passing of the president. And they were comfortable with these arrangements. This was not something that they felt was inappropriate or somehow ghoulish. As difficult as this long goodbye with Alzheimer's has been, this day has been one that has been long planned. I wouldn't diminish at all the difficulty that Mrs. Reagan faces, but every step of this is something the family was a part of.
And I'm sure, Frank, as you well know, this must bring so much comfort to Nancy Reagan and to her children and their family and friends, how the nation is pouring out their expressions of love for this president.
Well, yeah, and you see her in the back of the car waving. That, to me, is a haunting picture, because knowing how much this president was a part of her life, and especially when they were here in Washington, how must she feel now? How alone must she feel? That's really very powerful.
Jeff Greenfield, to our viewers not only in the United States but around the world who are watching right now, explain what is happening in an American perspective to people who may not necessarily appreciate the significance of this event.
Well, this actually might make more sense than some other American political traditions to international viewers, because they are going back to Washington for a final farewell. There have been presidents who have not wanted to go back to Washington. In Richard Nixon's case, I think the reason is fairly obvious. That was a place he left under mixed or muddled or disgraceful circumstances. But Harry Truman didn't go back to Washington. He decided to be buried in independence. I think what this is about is that if you think about the Reagan presidency, they laid some pretty great store on restoring a certain sense of grandeur, particularly after the informal presidency of Jimmy Carter, the man who carried his own garment bags and was a very kind of blue jeans kind of guy. It was often said by Reagan's aides that he would not take his suit jacket off in the Oval Office because he felt it hurt the dignity. And so the fact that Mrs. Reagan wanted this kind of farewell with all of the pomp and majesty, for remember, a Washington outsider, a guy who often made fun of Washington, says something about, I think, about that as president, Reagan was committed to saying, no, the grandeur and the gravitas of a president is something I'm going to embrace, even if my political position came from outside the nation's capital.
And yet he was also the first to admit that experience felt imprisoning at certain points of his presidency. And we met a young man that had developed a relationship with him during the presidency when the White House adopted a local school from the district, and he had this pen pal relationship with this young man, and this young man described the president coming to his house for dinner one night in a very rough part of the district and eating on television trays and eating a television dinner with his family, and how at home he was.
And I want our viewers to take a look into the right part of the screen. That's the Capitol Rotunda. And here's a word that many of us are only today beginning to understand what it means. It's a catafalque, which is a platform. What you're seeing is the platform where President Reagan's casket will rest while lying in state in the rotunda. The catafalque is made of rough pine boards, and it's covered with black cloth designed by Benjamin French. It was originally constructed in 1865 to support the casket of Abraham Lincoln. The catafalque has been used for all of those who have lain in state in the Capitol Rotunda, Professor Dallek, since that time. We're watching the motorcade, Nancy Reagan's hand waving to the crowds as it moves up Constitution Avenue. But talk a little bit about this Capitol Rotunda catafalque.
Yeah, it goes back to Abraham Lincoln. There have been 27 people who've lain in state in that rotunda. The first one was Henry Clay in 1852, the great compromiser, the Speaker of the House, the Senator. Of course, this is before the Lincoln catafalque was constructed. But what it gets back to is this whole issue of how Europeans, we were talking about that before, may view this. See, they see this as our exercise in American majesty, royalty. See, we have no kings, no queens, no nobility, but our presidents, in a sense, fill that role. And this kind of ceremonial is familiar, I think, to Europeans. They don't find it so alien. They don't find it so exclusively American, though it does have particular American stamps to it, you see. Also, what I found interesting is Nancy Reagan, the crowd applauds her. She responds. See, the institution of First Lady is an important part of our history now, too. And this goes back to Eleanor Roosevelt, who really began the modern institution of First Lady. We know that famous story when she was told by Harry Truman, FDR's successor, that her husband had died. The president has died, he told her. And he said, "Is there anything, Mrs. Roosevelt, I can do for you?" And she replied, "Harry, is there anything I can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." But she was a large person. She created this, and Nancy Reagan fills that bill now, fills that role. And people applaud her the way they might applaud a president.
You know, let's listen in briefly as we see this honor guard moving up these steps, the west side of Capitol Hill. These are the steps where the casket will be carried. It will be a very, very beautiful ceremony as it's carried up these many, many stairs leading up to the rotunda. But as we watch this, let's listen into the music a little bit as these marching bands proceed up Constitution Avenue. This procession moving down Constitution Avenue towards Capitol Hill, the procession bringing the casket of Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, to the Rotunda on Capitol Hill, where his body will lie in state tomorrow until Friday morning, when the formal state funeral will take place at the National Cathedral. In the coming moments, Paula, we will see a very, very dramatic flyover over the nation's capital. Normally, planes cannot enter this restricted airspace, but 21 U.S. military aircraft, F-15s, will fly over to underscore their support, their honoring of this President of the United States. It is about to happen.
And the Air Force describes it will look like a giant V. A single plane will fly the lead position, followed by 5 waves of 4 plane formations at 10-second intervals. And then what you'll see at the very end is the last part of the formation is one of the F-16s performing the missing man maneuver, where that aircraft will shoot straight up and leave the others behind.
A symbolic moment that someone is missing, in this particular case, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. During this flyover, all of the local area airports, Reagan National Airport, which is not all that far away, Baltimore Washington International Airport, Dulles Airport out in suburban Virginia, all of these airports will have a hold on flights as these aircraft from the 4th Fighter Wing, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in South Carolina, will participate. And one additional note, they will fly, Paula, at a very low altitude. It will have a chilling effect, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 feet, as they fly over the nation's capital.
That's enough to make you tremble on the street.
When I got off the shuttle today, coming down to Washington, the pilot came after me and said, "I want you to know something." He said, "All of us," he said, maybe it was our military background, he said, but we love Ronald Reagan. I mean, he was at pains to communicate that to me. It's certainly true, Reagan built up the military. He was a passionate advocate of a muscular foreign policy. So it may be even more symbolic for Reagan than even for some other presidents that a flyover by the members of the military would honor a president who was so committed to building up America's defense.
The military had a long tradition in this country of being nonpartisan. George Marshall, who was principal aide to Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, he would never laugh at Roosevelt's jokes, wouldn't respond to Roosevelt's jokes. He didn't want to be taken in by Roosevelt's politics and become partisan in any way. But Reagan, after the Vietnam War, after the painful experience of Vietnam, the military found Reagan a friend, a supporter. And they really became, I think, much more Republican since the end of that Vietnam War with the advent of Reagan.
Based on the solemnity of this crowd, I think about the only other thing we're going to hear other than the jets flying over at 3,000 feet will be a 21-gun salute, which will clearly pierce the noise barrier. And I'm sure Professor Dallek knows the answer to this question, but how they arrived at the magic number 21.
Oh.
I've got it right here in my Trivial Pursuit facts.
I can print this for you.
It's a very complicated formula. Ships typically had 7 cannons, and so as the ship would fire each cannon.
Here it comes. Here's the first wave. Let's watch this flyover over the nation's capital, pay tribute to Ronald Reagan. final aircraft in that missing man formation. Judy Woodruff, you were there. You were underneath that flyover. Tell our viewers what you saw.
Well, if I can tell you, as someone who's sitting on the balcony of the Cannon House office building just directly across the street from the Capitol, you could see how low those jets were and how closely they came. They were directly over the Capitol of the United States. There was one plane in the front, and then they were in groups of 4, and then finally, as you all have just said, the final group of 4, one plane missing in the middle. That plane shot straight up just as it approached the Capitol. The sound was deafening. And everyone, there are a lot of people gathered here on the ground, not as many as on Constitution Avenue. We are on the other side of the Capitol, but everyone was looking up into the sky, holding their hand up to their eyes, because the sun, of course, is pretty high up still at this point. It's almost 7 o'clock here in Washington, but it's early June, and the sun is up there, and people were looking.
You know, Judy, it was a 21 aircraft flyover, 21 being the number of honor, like a 21-gun salute. One historic footnote that I want Professor Delic and our Jeff Greenfield to respond to. During the state funeral for President John F. Kennedy, he had a 50-jet flyover, one to represent each state. It underscores that individual families can change the rules whenever they want.
Yeah, there's no question, and Mrs. Reagan has had, I think, a very substantial impact on the way in which this funeral has been shaped, and the music that they choose, how they want to bury the president. The Reagan burial is going to be back in California. They're doing it at sunset. They're doing it at dusk. They've purposely committed themselves to that.
John Kennedy apparently at one point was thinking that, you know, and he was 43 years old. I don't think he thought he would die in office, but I think the family after he died was thinking of perhaps taking his body by sea and burying him in Boston, because he was a man who loved the sea so much, and they ultimately decided, no, he belongs in Arlington. So it is, as Professor
That was
Delic
Jackie
says.
Kennedy who insisted that he be, and she wanted the eternal flame. She had aides find out about that eternal flame in Paris in order to have the same thing at the gravesite in Arlington for Kennedy.
And what we're seeing unfold on the right part of our screen now are the number of dignitaries that are showing up. Senator John Warner there, and in advance of First Lady Nancy Reagan's arrival. The security, as you can imagine, intense. I'm picking Senator Trent Lott out of the crowd. Who else do you see there?
Rick Santorum is standing next to the senator from Pennsylvania, standing next to Senator John Warner. There are senators, there are members of the House of Representatives. The Supreme Court justices are there, as is the diplomatic corps, the president's cabinet, and other invited guests. This motorcade getting very, very close to the west front of the U.S. Capitol. Jeff Greenfield, before we get to Jeff Greenfield, Judy Woodruff is up there. Judy, tell our viewers why they've decided to move the casket up these many stairs of the west front, because normally it would be the east front that's considered the main entrance to the U.S. Capitol.
Wolf, I'm going to have to take a guess here because I don't know the answer. Perhaps someone else does. My instinct tells me it has something to do with the fact that the sun is on that part of the Capitol, and that, you know, Mrs. Reagan has been very conscious this week of the setting sun. Her husband will be laid to rest as the sun sets over California, the state that he loved so much. And I'm guessing here that perhaps that was part of the reason.
Well, I'm going to let Professor Delic answer the question. There are two reasons why they've decided on the west front, but go ahead, Professor.
Well, one is because the east front is under construction and they can't do it at this time. The other is that the west front was where Reagan was inaugurated, and he did that on purpose because he wanted to face west, looking out toward California, and so it's appropriate that.
And even then, the west part of the Capitol accommodated bigger crowds.
Yes.
He was nodding.
Exactly.
The downside of that, Jeff, is that there are hundreds and hundreds of stairs that these honor guard will have to carry what is probably a 600 or 700 pound casket up these stairs under very hot and difficult conditions.
One of the things that makes the military what it is that when they are told this is what is going to happen, they say, okay, we will make it happen. And in this case, Professor Delic's exactly right. In 1981, he was, I believe, the first president to be inaugurated on the West Front. He wanted to face his home of California. He wanted to face America, not Europe. This is a very important symbol, and it also symbolized a break from the past. He wanted to say this is a new kind of administration. And I think even if the East Front had not been under construction, they would have chosen this much more arduous path, because it was exactly what Ronald Reagan did when he was president.
One of our producers was out during a rehearsal for this procession, and he talked about the number of times the military escorts will have to stop on the stairs because, as you were saying, Wolf, the sheer weight of the casket.
Not only will they stop,
right?
Not only will they stop, but there will be a new team, a new crew that, in effect, will come in and continue carrying that casket up those stairs. Frank, I don't know if you were there on January 20th, 1981, on the West Front of the U.S. Capitol when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, the 40th President of the United States. But if you weren't, I'll just share with you one of the reasons he wanted to be inaugurated there, and he was the first president to be inaugurated on the West Front, is because it could accommodate so many more people than on the East Front.
And one thing should be said about Ronald Reagan, this notion of his sense of timing and choreography. He has managed his goodbyes very carefully and very consciously. Quick story, when he and Mrs. Reagan left the White House for the last time, they climbed aboard Marine One, and they had the pilots circle around the White House. Famous story. The President turned to Mrs. Reagan and said, "There's our little bungalow down there." And then off they went, without much sentiment, without much more emotion than that, to move into the next phase of their life.
Is the extent to which Reagan took his impulse from Franklin Roosevelt, because FDR gets the nomination, he's governor of New York, he's in Albany, he's the first president to get on or nominee to get on a plane to fly to the convention in Chicago, where he gives a speech in which he talks about a New Deal. So you see, the way Reagan understood Roosevelt was breaking precedent, moving in a new direction. Reagan does this also in 1981.
Well, we talked about his inauguration. We should probably point out that the flag that is used to cover the casket is the same flag that flew over the Capitol on January 20th, 1981, the day of that inauguration we've been talking about.
That was also the day, and this was no accident on the part of the Iranian government, that as Ronald Reagan was taking the oath of office, quite literally at that moment, they waited till he was president, and the hostages were being released as Reagan took office, which a lot of people, I think people unconsciously, maybe consciously, saw that as quite a happy augur, quite a good omen. New president, Americans released. And it was a day that not just the West Front setting showed a real break from the past. I mean, Ronald Reagan had a very good first day as president.
444 days that those Americans were held hostage in Tehran, coming to an end on January 20th, 1981, the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. This procession about to wind up on Constitution Avenue. Once it stops, the casket will be carried by the honor guard up the stairs into the Capitol Rotunda, where dignitaries, of course, have already gathered. And that catafalque, as it's called, the platform, once again in the center of that rotunda, is where the casket will be placed, and tens of thousands of Americans and people from all over the world, if they happen to be in Washington, Paula, will be allowed to go up and pay their respects over the next 24 hours plus to this president.
And what they will see once they get there is the American flag placed to the northeast of the casket, the presidential flag to the southeast of the casket, and the stars of the flag will lie over the president's heart.
Part of the tradition is to keep track of the numbers of people who go by or past the casket. Wonderful anecdote about Lyndon Johnson, who, when he died and his body lay in repose in the LBJ library, the director of the library, Harry Middleton, asked an aide to keep track of the numbers of people who went by the casket with a clicker. And the aide said to him, "Harry, why are you doing that?" And Middleton replied, "Because I know that somewhere, sometime, Lyndon's going to ask me." Well, it speaks volumes about LBJ's personality, I
Certainly
guess.
does.
Judy Woodruff is up on Capitol Hill. She's watching all of this. She's got a very good vantage point. She's at the Cannon House office building right next to the main part of the Capitol. Set the scene for us a little bit, Judy.
Well, Wolf, we believe we saw the car carrying Mrs. Reagan separated from the caisson and drive up Independence Avenue and pull in to this side of the Capitol just a few moments ago. We know that Mrs. Reagan is, the plan has been for her to be, I believe, standing at the head of the stairs to watch as her husband is carried up those stairs on the west front of the Capitol. But Wolf, this is, again, we can't emphasize enough how carefully planned every aspect of this is. I heard you all discussing what is going to happen once the ceremony begins inside. It is being called a state funeral, but this will be a shorter service than the service there will be on Friday. Even so, 800 people will be inside the rotunda in just a few minutes. They are, if not already that many in there. Every one of them a VIP, 65 or 70 of them people who are part of Mrs. Reagan's entourage. And we know that, again, the three speakers are the President Pro Tem of the Senate, Ted Stevens, the Senator from Alaska, Republican Senator from Alaska, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert, a Republican from Illinois, and finally Vice President Dick Cheney, who will be speaking. Each of the three, Stevens, Hastert, and the Vice President, will place a wreath at the casket when they finish speaking. The stars on the American flag over the casket are going to be lying toward the east side, we are told. His feet, the president's feet, toward the west. The stars on the flag will be lying over the president's heart.
This caisson getting very close to the bottom of the stairs on the west front of the U.S. Capitol, where the casket will be removed and carried up those stairs. I just want our viewers to also know that once the coffin is placed on that platform right in the middle of the rotunda, the coffin will be guarded around the clock by members of the U.S. Military Honor Guard. There will be 5 officers at any given time, one from each service, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard, and they will rotate, they will change every half hour, every 30 minutes. A new honor guard will come in to guard this casket as it lies in state in the rotunda.
It's still fascinating to me, the level of detail that we're going to be looking at here, even in the climbing of the stairs. We're going to see a team shift 3 times to accommodate the heavy weight of this casket in this horrible heat, but they're going to climb 83 stairs, stop for a while, then the procession will climb an additional 33 stairs to the rotunda, enter the rotunda through the west door, 116 total stairs in all.
I have to admit to you, this brings back a particular memory. When Robert Kennedy was killed, I was a young, very junior aide on a staff, and the body lay in repose in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and we did half-hour honor guards, I mean, not military. And again, this is a very different kind of occasion. I keep coming back to the point that this is much more a commemoration and celebration of a life fully lived. No one will ever ask, gee, imagine what would have happened if Ronald Reagan had been able to fulfill his full term. He did, for good or ill. And we have an arc to judge. And it's in such sharp contrast to some other ceremonies here, particularly of President Kennedy. This is a day when you can, when for all the mourning that we talk about, you can actually say, all right, you know, Ronald Reagan had his full run.
And there is the casket. It's about to go off the caisson. To the left of your screen, you see a riderless horse once again. To our viewers who may just be tuning in, that symbolizes the commander-in-chief. No longer there. The boots strapped backwards into the stirrups of that riderless horse. This is the scene from atop the west side of the U.S. Capitol. The casket about to be removed from the caisson. It's made its way up Constitution Avenue to Capitol Hill, and it will now shortly be carried by hand by the honor guard up these stairs and then placed inside the Capitol Rotunda.
And it hasn't been confirmed yet whether the Reagan children will follow the casket into the Rotunda. We are told that Nancy Reagan will be entering from a side door around the back side of the Capitol. We'll be watching for that.
Yeah, Nancy Reagan is already there. Her limousine has arrived. She's making her way, though, to the from the east side to the west side. She'll be there to receive the casket and so many other dignitaries. The diplomatic corps, by the way, is already in place. Representatives of about 170 countries have been invited to participate. Those would be the countries that have formal diplomatic relations, for Professor Dallek, with the United States. The ambassadors or chargés are here now, but on Friday, heads of state, heads of government from all over the world will arrive in Washington for the National Cathedral ceremony, the funeral service. This may turn out to be the largest gathering of world leaders in Washington, D.C. ever.
Can I point out something before you start? Because about the only thing we need to listen to before you start with the answer, the casket will not come off the caisson until we hear the 21-gun salute. And then we'll hear a military band play.
Well, you know, what I'm struck by is the fact that we were offshoots of Great Britain. And though it's well over 200 years, in a sense, what one can talk about is the ceremonial that the British are so adept at. A personal memory, if I may, I taught at Oxford one year. I had to give an inaugural address. The amount of detail that I was instructed in as to how I would wear my academic garb, how I would be escorted by a vice chancellor with a medieval mace, would come to the top of the staircase where I was going to go down to lecture, and how they'd bang the mace 3 times on the floor. I'd get down there to give my lecture. Nobody introduced me. You see, the English tradition is, well, you're so well known, you don't need an introduction, I guess. But I think of the English, because this is where I think, in part, Paula, your point about you marvel at the detail, but I think it is a kind of English tradition that we in a sense, hark to.
All right, let's listen in as this service begins.
also talk about the fact the Speaker of the House will be speaking.
Inside the Rotunda now, where you can see that members of the Reagan family have already arrived. It wasn't clear whether Patty Davis and her brother Ron Reagan would follow the casket into the Rotunda. They obviously arrived with Nancy Reagan.
And in the front of the screen, our viewers are seeing the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. They're all gathered inside, awaiting the casket to be carried up those stairs of the west side of the U.S. Capitol. Ron Reagan, Patty Davis. Mrs. Reagan will be inside shortly. Once she is, we're told, there will be the 21-gun salute, which will result eventually in the casket being removed from the caisson and carried up those stairs. The 21-gun salute, an honor for a president of the United States who has passed away. It goes back, by the way, Paul, into the 17th century when cannons would be fired by a defeated enemy to show they had expended their ammunition. Let's listen in again as we await this 21-gun salute. As we await this casket to arrive here in the Rotunda, where there are members of the House and the Senate, the leadership of Washington awaiting the arrival, and this ceremony about to begin. I want to bring in our senior White House correspondent, John King. The Vice President is here. He will speak, John. The President is at the G8 summit where you are in Sea Island, Georgia. It was a difficult decision, I assume, for him to decide not to come back to Washington in advance in order to participate in this event.
It was a difficult decision, White House officials tell us, Wolf, but they also say that the senior White House staff was in touch with the Reagan family and that Nancy Reagan relayed word that she fully understood that it was important for the president to stay at this critical international summit. Mr. Bush, though, as soon as he gets back to Washington tomorrow night, he and the First Lady will go to the Rotunda tomorrow night. They will visit the casket there. They also will participate in memorial reflections there, and they, after leaving the Capitol tomorrow night, Wolf, when they get back to Washington, they will go to Blair House, where Nancy Reagan is staying right across the street from the White House while she is in town, and we are told the President and the First Lady will spend some private time with Nancy Reagan. We also know from the President's staff today that he, even while here at this summit, has been working on the eulogy he will deliver Friday at the National Cathedral. Aides tell us to look for it to run about 10 to 12 minutes. Not so much this President's personal reflections on Ronald Reagan. Aides say this President Bush wants to deliver a eulogy on what he believes Ronald Reagan meant to the country. Wolf?
All right, John King explaining why the President is not here. The Vice President will be speaking together with the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, the President Pro Tem of the Senate, Senator Ted Stevens, the ranking Republican member, the majority leader in the majority member of the U.S. Senate, not the majority leader, but the senator with the longest continuing service in the U.S. Senate. We're looking at these live pictures of representatives of the Senate and the House who have come to pay tribute to this President of the United States. Paula, that casket will be coming in. Go ahead.
I just saw a face I had not seen in a while, that of Dan Quayle, standing next to Trent Lott.
And here it comes, the color guard, the honor guard, moving in. This next phase of this service, this funeral, this memorial service to the 40th President of the United States is about to begin, so let's listen once again.
Let us pray. The poet T.S. Eliot wrote, "Neither does the actor suffer, nor the patient act, but both are fixed in an eternal patience, an eternal act. And the wheel turns. The wheel turns and is forever still." Ronald Wilson Reagan had many roles to play in life: husband, father, governor. But the most notable role on the world stage was that of the 40th President of the United States of America. With his style and grace, he made it seem easy. With his compassion and sense of timing, he brought strength of character to the nation and enkindled hope in a darkened world. As the patient, he brought humility to greatness and presided over embracing life to its natural end and dying with dignity, surrounded by love. To you, O Lord, ever patient with all of us, ever active in all of us, be praise and thanks for the life and impact Ronald Reagan has had upon us all. Support with your grace the Reagan family, and especially Mrs. Nancy Reagan, who stood by him in memorable moments of history and never left him in the long moments of difficult performance when the wheel turned all so slowly. Inspired by President Reagan, empower all of us, Lord, to employ our part in crumbling the walls of separation and in opening the gates to a globalized world. May our stillness here help us to remain faithful and patient with those suffering and to make decisions that will renew faith in the future. All-powerful God, fix America in your eternal patience, in your eternal act, as the wheel turns, now and forever. Amen.
Mrs. Reagan, Patty, Ron, Michael, distinguished guests, members of the Reagan family, and friends of Ronald Reagan in America and throughout the world. Tonight, President Ronald Reagan has returned to the People's House to be honored by millions of Americans who loved him. Since 1824, under this rotunda, our nation has paid final tribute to many dedicated public servants. President Abraham Lincoln was the first president to lie in state under this Capitol dome. In the coming days, thousands will come to these hallowed halls to say goodbye to another son of Illinois who, like Lincoln, appealed to our best hopes, not our worst fears. In the life of any nation, few men forever alter the course of history. Ronald Reagan was one of those men. He rose from a young boy who didn't have much to a man who had it all, including the love of a faithful partner and friend he found in his wife, Nancy. The true measure of any man is what he does with the opportunities life offers. By that standard, Ronald Reagan was one of America's greatest. He first proved that as governor of California and later as president of the United States. When Ronald Reagan was sworn in as our 40th president, this nation was gripped by a powerful malaise. Inflation and unemployment were soaring, and the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War. By the time President Reagan left office, he had reversed the trend of ever-increasing government control over our lives, restored our defense capabilities, guided us through the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and set in motion policies which ultimately led to the collapse of the evil empire. His integrity, vision, and commitment were respected by all. But history's final judgment, I believe, will remember most his ability to inspire us. President Reagan put it best when he said, "The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one that gets the people to do the greatest things." This president inspired Americans by reaching out far beyond what he could attain. Like a good coach, he understood the value of a goal isn't always in achieving it. Sometimes it's enough to simply look out into the future and remind people what is possible. And often, President Reagan achieved the impossible. He reminded us that government is not the solution. The solution lies in each of us. True American heroes are ordinary people who live their lives with extraordinary character and strength. President Reagan showed us freedom was not just a slogan. He actually brought freedom to hundreds of thousands of people around this globe by opposing oppressive regimes. Those of us from the World War II generation looked up to him for his moral courage. In him, we saw leadership of great men like Eisenhower, who led the way and moved us to follow. On a wintry day in 1981, Ronald Reagan stood on the steps that lie just behind these doors to deliver his first inaugural address. He spoke of a journal written by a young American who went to France in 1917 and died for the cause of freedom. From that journal, he read these words: "I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure, I will fight cheerfully, and I will do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended upon me alone." Throughout his life, Ronald Reagan bore our burdens as if the income did depend on him alone. We will all remember him as an unparalleled leader and an exceptional man who lifted our nation and set the world on a new path. President Reagan achieved greatness in his life. Some might even argue he transcended it. He could not have accomplished this without Nancy. Nancy is one of the finest first ladies these United States have ever known. And the love Ronald and Nancy Reagan shared touched the hearts of people everywhere. In 1989, President Reagan delivered his farewell address from the Oval Office. In that speech, the President spoke of the shining city on a hill that, after 200 years, 2 centuries, still stands strong and true on the granite ridge. Now it is our turn to thank Ronald Reagan for making us believe in that shining city. And as we say farewell, his last words as president echo across this nation. If we listen, we will hear him whisper the humble words he used to sum up his revolution. All in all, not bad at all.
Mrs. Reagan, Mr. Vice President, members of Congress, and distinguished guests, Ronald Reagan's long journey has finally drawn to a close. It is altogether fitting and proper that he has returned to this Capitol Rotunda, like another great son of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, so the nation can say goodbye. This Capitol building is, for many, the greatest symbol of democracy and freedom in the world. It brings to mind the shining city on a hill, which President Reagan so often spoke. It is the right place to honor a man who so faithfully defended our freedom and so successfully helped extend the blessings of liberty to millions of people around the world. Mrs. Reagan, thank you for sharing your husband with us, for your steadfast love and for your great faith. We pray for you and for your family in this time of great mourning. But as we mourn, we must also celebrate the life and the vision of one of America's greatest presidents. His story and values are quintessentially American. Born in Tampico, Illinois, and then raised in Dixon, Illinois, he moved west to follow his dreams. He brought with him a Midwest optimism, and he blended it with a Western can-do spirit. In 1980, the year of the Reagan Revolution, his vision of hope, of growth, of opportunity was exactly what the American people needed and wanted. His message touched a fundamental core that is deeply embedded in the American experience. President Reagan dared to dream that America had a special mission. He believed in the essential goodness of the American people and that we had a special duty to promote peace and freedom for the rest of the world. Against the advice of the timid, he sent a chilling message to authoritarian governments everywhere that the civilized world would not rest until freedom reigned in every corner of the globe. While others worried, President Reagan persevered. When others weakened, President Reagan stood tall. When others stepped back, President Reagan stepped forward. And he did it all with great humility, with great charm, and with great humor. Tonight, we will open these doors and let the men and women who Ronald Reagan served so faithfully file past and say goodbye to a man who meant so much to so many. It is their being here that I think would mean more to him than any words that we may say. Because it was from America's great and good people that Ronald Reagan drew his strength. In the years ahead, we will tell our grandchildren about this night when we gathered here to honor the man from Illinois who became the son of California and then the son of all America. And then our grandchildren will tell their grandchildren, and President Reagan's spirit and eternal faith in America will carry on. Ronald Reagan helped make our country and this world a better place to live. But he always believed that our best days were ahead of us, not behind us. I can still hear him say, with that twinkle in his eye, "You ain't seen nothing yet." President Reagan once said, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." 20 years ago, President Reagan stood on the beaches of Normandy to honor those who made a life by what they gave. Recalling the men who scaled the cliffs and crossed the beaches in a merciless hail of bullets, he asked, who were these men? These ordinary men doing extraordinary things. His answer was simple and direct. They were Americans. So I can think of no higher tribute or honor or title to confer upon Ronald Reagan than just to simply say he was an American. Godspeed, Mr. President. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Mrs. Reagan, members of the President's family, colleagues, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, fellow citizens. Knowing that this moment would come has not made it any easier to see the honor guard and the flag draped before us and to begin America's farewell to President Ronald Reagan. He said goodbye to us in a letter that showed his great courage and love for America. Yet for his friends and for his country, the parting comes only now. And in this national vigil of mourning, we show how much America loved this good man and how greatly we will miss him. A harsh winter morning in 1985 brought the inaugural ceremony inside to this rotunda. And standing in this place for the 50th presidential inauguration, Ronald Reagan spoke of a nation that was hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That was how he saw America, and that is how America came to know him. There was a kindness, simplicity, and goodness of character that marked all the years of his life. When you mourn a man of 93, no one is left who remembers him as a child in his mother's arms. Ronald Wilson Reagan's life began in a time and place so different from our own, in a quiet town on the prairie on the 6th of February, 1911. Nell and Jack Reagan would live long enough to see the kind of man they had raised, but they could never know all that destiny had in store for the boy they called Dutch. And if they could witness this scene in 2004, their son taken to his rest with the full honors of the United States, they would be so proud of all he had done with the life they gave him and the things they taught him. President Reagan once said, "I learned from my father the value of hard work and ambition and maybe a little something about telling a story." That was the Ronald Reagan who confidently set out on his own from Dixon, Illinois during the Great Depression, the man who would one day speak before cameras and crowds with such ease and self-command. From my mother, said President Reagan, I learned the value of prayer. My mother told me that everything in life happened for a purpose. She said all things were part of God's plan, even the most disheartening setbacks, and in the end, everything worked out for the best. This was the Ronald Reagan who had faith not just in his own gifts and his own future, but in the possibilities of every life. The cheerful spirit that carried him forward was more than a disposition. It was the optimism of a faithful soul who trusted in God's purposes and knew those purposes to be right and true. He once said, "There's no question I am an idealist," which is another way of saying, I am an American. We usually associate that quality with youth, and yet one of the most idealistic men ever to become president was also the oldest. He excelled in professions that have left many others jaded and self-satisfied, and yet somehow remained untouched by the worst influences of fame or power. If Ronald Reagan ever uttered a cynical or cruel or selfish word, the moment went unrecorded. Those who knew him in his youth and those who knew him a lifetime later all remember his largeness of spirit, his gentle instincts, and a quiet rectitude that drew others to him. Seen now at a distance, his strengths as a man and as a leader are only more impressive. It's the nature of the city of Washington that men and women arrive, leave their mark, and go their way. Some figures who seemed quite large and important in their day are sometimes forgotten or remembered with ambivalence. Yet nearly a generation after the often impassioned debates of the Reagan years, what lingers from that time is almost all good. And this is because of the calm and kind man who stood at the center of events. We think back with appreciation for the decency of our 40th president and respect for all that he achieved. After so much turmoil in the 60s and 70s, our nation had begun to lose confidence, and some were heard to say that the presidency might even be too big for one man. That phrase did not survive the 1980s. For decades, America had waged a Cold War, and few believed it could possibly end in our own lifetimes. The president was one of those few, and it was the vision and the will of Ronald Reagan that gave hope to the oppressed, shamed the oppressors, and ended an evil empire. More than any other influence, the Cold War was ended by the perseverance and courage of one man who answered falsehood with truth and overcame evil with good. Ronald Reagan was more than an historic figure. He was a providential man who came along just when our nation and the world most needed him. And believing as he did that there is a plan at work in each life, he accepted not only the great duties that came to him, but also the great trials that came near the end. When he learned of his illness, his first thoughts were of Nancy. And who else but Ronald Reagan could face his own decline and death with a final message of hope to his country, telling us that for America, there is always a bright dawn ahead. Fellow Americans, here lies a graceful and a gallant man. Nancy, none of us can take away the sadness you are feeling. I hope it is a comfort to know how much he means to us and how much you mean to us as well. We honor your grace, your own courage, and above all, the great love that you gave to your husband. When these days of ceremony are completed, the nation returns him to you for the final journey to the West. And when he is laid to rest under the Pacific sky, we will be thinking of you as we commend to the Almighty the soul of his faithful servant, Ronald Wilson Reagan.
Let us bow for the benediction. O giver of every good and perfect gift, accept our gratitude for the life of your servant, President Ronald Reagan, whose love for freedom summoned our nation to embrace our best hopes and not our worst fears. Thank you for his ability to plant seeds of confidence and not doubt, and to lift liberty's lamp until totalitarian towers tumbled. In the days to come, remind us of America's opportunity to remain a shining city on a hill. Continue to comfort those who mourn. In a special way, be near to Mrs. Nancy Reagan and the family. May the death of this beloved leader prompt us to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly day by day. Now fill us with your peace as we trust you, so that we may overflow with hope by the power of your Spirit. Amen.
CNN in Hong Kong, I'm Stan Grant.
And I'm Christy Lou Stout, and you've been looking at live pictures from Washington, D.C.
You're seeing live pictures there, still coming from Washington, D.C., of the state funeral of Ronald Reagan. We saw the funeral procession, of course, with people lining 15 deep along the avenue to pay their respects for the late President Reagan.
Now, this is the first ceremony of the late president's state funeral taking place at the Capitol Rotunda. You can see the flag-draped casket lying there in the center of the building. The body of the former president will lie in state there until Friday U.S. time this week.
We'll give people a chance to pay their respects and say their goodbyes to President Reagan. Of course, his body had lain in repose in the library in California, where the president had lived, and about 100,000 people have been to pay their respects there to President Reagan.
That's right. Tens of thousands of people have already paid their respects to the president where he lied in repose in Simi Valley, California. Now, it's expected that hundreds of thousands will visit him as he lies in state there in the Rotunda.
Once again, we're looking at live pictures there coming from Washington. Those shots now coming outside, where, of course, President Reagan is now lying in state. We saw the state funeral procession take place a little bit earlier. The state funeral, of course, separate to the state funeral ceremony. The state funeral lasts for about a week. The state funeral ceremony, which is expected to be one of the best attended, will take place on Friday. Of course, world leaders coming from everywhere to attend that funeral service.
So Ronald Reagan, the 40th president of the United States, he died in Los Angeles on Saturday, aged 93, after a 10-year battle with Alzheimer's disease. And now you can see the flag-draped coffin lying in the center of the Rotunda building where he is lying in state.
Of course, speaking during today's ceremony was the Vice President Dick Cheney, the President George W. Bush, of course, busy with the G8 summit in Georgia. And we heard the Vice President there paying his tribute to President Reagan and saying, many people are now saying, that he'll be long remembered for his role in bringing about an end to the Cold War. The body of the late President Reagan lying in state there in the Rotunda in Washington. Many observers saying a very different state funeral service, state funeral procession than we've seen in the past. The last held in 1973 for Lyndon Johnson. And of course, memory still alive today of the state funeral of John Kennedy. Much grief there, of course, in the nature that he died. But this one being seen by many observers is very much a parade, a chance for people to pay their respects.
Grief and outpouring expressed there in the Rotunda, and, as well as outside in Washington, D.C., where we saw crowds of people lining up to pay their last respects to the president, largely seen as being a very popular political figure in the late 20th century.
Someone who embodied, as we heard from Vice President Cheney, embodied the very quintessential American journey. Someone from very humble beginnings, of course, went on to become a film star and later governor of California, and then later still the president of the United States.
So someone who many say embodied the American dream, if you will. Well, a short time from now, the Capitol Rotunda will be opened, allowing the public to view the former president's coffin as he lies in state. This after a day of events spanning the U.S. from west coast to east. Beginning in California, a band played Amazing Grace as a military honor guard placed Reagan's remains on board a jet for the cross-country trip. His widow Nancy and 3 children accompanied the casket on the 4.5-hour flight to Washington. After landing at Andrews Air Force Base, the casket was brought off the plane and greeted with a 21-gun salute. Another honor guard then carried the late president to a waiting hearse. And then a journey through the streets of Washington. A motorcade brought the casket into the city and then transferred it to a horse-drawn caisson for a military procession to the Capitol.
Now, Washington police expect about 200,000 people to pay their respects as Reagan lies in state. Thousands, as we said, lined the city's streets, some turning out hours earlier to watch the procession wind its way through. Some had travelled a great distance to say their goodbyes.